Is up and running. I believe we are live. Hello, hello. Welcome to Peace Mindedly, a podcast featuring peaceful bridge makers. This is Sarah Jamshidi, your host today. I'm just hoping that everything goes all right today because I do not have my assistant producer and you're stuck with me. I am usually not a very bad company. Conversation today is an important conversation for me personally because I have first-hand experience of what happened to the person that we are discussing, and also journalism that is very dear in my heart, and I practiced journalism back in Iran. To explain all of those, I have a group of experts that I am very excited and fascinated to have for our program. Nazila Fathi is the author of the Lonely War: One Woman's Account of a Struggle for Modern Iran, and former New York Times correspondent in Tehran for more than 18 years. Barbara Slavin is the Distinguished Fellow at Simpson Center and also former director of the Future of Iran Initiative. And Kehran Nazish is award-winning journalist and founding director of Coalition for Women in Journalism, short for CFWIJ. Very, very welcome, ladies. I am super excited to have you in our show.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
First, let me explain what's actually happening in Iran and for our conversation, and then we are going to go right into the discussion about the subject. So we are talking about for the sake of this program, we are talking about Niloofar Hamedi and Elahe Mohammadi and the fate of journalism in Iran. Hamedi and Mohammadi were among the first reporters who uncovered the death of Mahsa Amini, the 22-year-old woman who was detained by Iran's morality police and for improper hijab, for bad hijab, and basically she died three days later in a hospital. For those of you who do not know morality police, they are people who are strolling in the streets of Tehran with very big cars, and they stop women for not having proper hijab. They arrest them, and the fate of those women are really in the hands of those people. I've been arrested for bad hijab, so it's usually depends on from simple warning to whipping and lashing and so many other very, very horrible things. So Mahsa Amini died in the custody of morality police in Tehran. Niloofar Hamedi broke the story by publishing photographs of the lying brain dead Mahsa Amini, and Elahe Mohammadi wrote about the story and about the funeral. Hamedi and Mohammadi's reporting caused a very, very big spark, and right now it's a full-fledged revolution in Iran, has conducted and led by women in the streets of Tehran and many of the big streets, big cities in Iran, and women are getting killed for wanting to change the bad law. According to the latest news that we received today, these two journalists may face a death penalty. And we are going to unfold all of those here in this program. This program is partnered with Journalism and Women Symposium, or JAWS. I'm very excited to have you all. Thank you so much. Nazila, I wanted to start with you. I wanted to see how it's like, to work in Iran and to conduct or file stories. Just give me the rundown of how you did your work back in Tehran.
Sarah June, hi. Thank you so much for having us here, and thank you for having this very timely discussion. I can talk about my own experience, but I haven't been in Iran for almost 14 years now. Things have changed, and I would say it has changed for the worse for reporters on the ground. As you said, just telling the truth about something that happened, and it was reported in by even news agencies inside the country, and to now face a death sentence is just horrifying. It was definitely not like this when I was in Iran. I started working as a reporter in the mid 1990s. And that was still during a very difficult time. Khomeini, the founder of the revolution, had died, and Rafsanjani, who had become sort of a more pragmatic president, was in office. And it was, I think, the first year since the revolution that they allowed people work for foreign media. And when I started out, I was not allowed to write. I never had a permanent press card. Everywhere I wanted to go, I had to get permission. I had to notify the government through a place called the Ministry of Islamic Guidance and Culture, where I was going. However, that changed over the years. And by the late 1990s, when Khatami came to office, things were a lot different. There were many local reporters, and I believe you were among them, who were doing the hard job. They were writing for what we called reformist newspapers back then. And so that made the job easier for us too, for those of us who were working with foreign reporters. And for the first time, I think the government or the regime realized that it was time to present a new image of the country. And we were the perfect people to do it. And when I say we, I'm referring to us as Iranians who spoke English, and we were trusted by the reporters that we worked with, like Barbara. So they decided to let us work, give us some freedom. And it was then that I started getting like press credentials that were longer than a week. They actually lasted for 3 months or for a year. The longest press credential that I had was an annual one. I had to renew it every year. But working gradually became easier. We had much more access. I wasn't required to notify the government wherever I was going. And I always had the freedom to pick up the phone and call people. But that came to a dramatic stop in 2009, which is when I had to leave the country. That was during the so-called green uprising, or some people refer to it as a green revolution. I don't like to call it revolution because revolution means change, and we never saw any kind of fundamental change. And I left the country. But from what I heard from colleagues who stayed behind, things didn't get easier. I mean, as you remember, there were others like Jason Rezaian, who worked for the Washington Post, and he was jailed without having done anything specific. He was never told that he'd done anything that was illegal. Mm-hmm. The charges were the regular mm-hmm. charges that they level against people as spies.
So I wonder, Barbara, you were in and out of Iran many times. And the last time you were, I believe you said that was 2013. Is that right? How was it? I mean, if you compare of the visits that you have had in the country, what kind of change did you see in Iran?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It was a fascinating experience. Every trip was different. I felt lucky that I started going when Rafsanjani was president, and then I was able to go a number of times when Khatami was the president, and so experienced a kind of explosion of Iranian media. I mean, there were so many different newspapers to read and many journalists, which also, as Nazila said, made it easier to be working for a foreign news organization. It was easy to get people to translate. I also found that many Iranians spoke English. And so after a while, I would make friends and I would be able to actually go and see people without taking a translator, sometimes not taking a driver. I'm sure the government probably knew who I was seeing anyway, but I gave myself the illusion of freedom. I think what I noticed also most of all was how Iranians became more aware of what was going on in the world. When I first started going there, there was, of course, no internet. There wasn't even really satellite television unless you had a dish. And so in the hotel where I stayed, there was nothing. I used to have to go to the offices of a French news agency, Agence France Presse, once a day to send my stories and also to find out what had happened in the world. It was like being dropped into a black hole. But that changed, and in subsequent visits, there was CNN suddenly in the hotel. There was a business center where you could send stories, and then, of course, there was the internet. There was wireless internet, and you could actually communicate. Now, perhaps people were eavesdropping on what you were writing, but there was communications. The internet so changed Iran, I think. And
Absolutely.
so you had this greater opening of the society at the same time, as Nazila said, the environment went up and down. 1999, when I believe you left, there was the crackdown on Salam newspaper and the crackdown on protests at Tehran University. Student was killed. Hatami was almost overthrown and was told that he had to agree to the crackdown or he would be overthrown by the IRGC. Other visits I went, I mean, my favorite visit, frankly, was after the September 11, 2001 attacks, when there was a kind of outburst of pro-Americanism in most sectors of society. It was really quite lovely. But of course, that changed under Ahmadinejad. And he liked journalists. He liked foreign journalists in particular. So I had very good access to Iran when Ahmadinejad was president, strangely enough. And it ended when Rouhani was inaugurated. That was the last time I got a visa to go there. I think is rather strange. But of course, we monitor, and we monitor thanks to the work that Iranian journalists have done and continue to do. And I think we were talking earlier about how it seems like it's this kind of pool of people that once one group leaves the field, emigrates, stops being journalists, gets thrown in prison, whatever, you have a whole new group of people who step up and do the work.
Nevertheless, it's never easy. Karen, I remember we were talking about your work and the groundwork that you are doing of helping many of the reporters, and you were explaining that Niloofar was one of the people who was really endangered for the work that she was doing, and she knew, many of us, I mean, even myself, maybe Nazila, we knew that we were putting ourselves in danger of just doing or reporting on the stories that government or the authority do not want us to fight. So can you, from going back to many years to now, tell us about your work and how you got did you get involved with Niloofar whatsoever?
So first of all, thank you. And it's also really nice to hear Nazila and Barbara talk about their experience a while ago. And like Barbara's last point is that, a lot of times journalists just leave and they emigrate, and then there's a new group of journalists. And that is something that was very surprising to us. So I will say we got more involved in Iran. I will say we are a press freedom organization focused on gender. And there are very few countries that are absolutely impossible for us to work on the ground, and Iran is one of them. Russia and China are two other countries. We monitor 128 countries, and Iran has always been one of the top countries.
Why Iran? Why it's very difficult to monitor countries like Iran?
It's difficult to get visas. It's difficult for us to, if we have our own staff, it's difficult to have security for them. And I'm talking about way before these protests, right? Like say 2018, 2019, when we're building our networks, it was impossible for us to have a representative on the ground. And there are very few nonprofits. Anyone who has worked in Iran knows that now we don't have a lot of nonprofits or international organizations who have the ability to work in Iran transparently. The way we have been working, I will say we still have had a network. And the way we had it was through journalist connections, very informally, to have that network where journalists are connected with each other. And sometimes we would bring them together for a meetup or a discussion or be in touch with them. And the way we got information out of Iran was usually when journalists got targeted, it was always word of mouth. And before the Mahsa Amini protests as well, we had been actually relocating a lot of Afghan journalists and Iranian journalists and a few Afghan journalists who had gone to Iran because they were escaping Afghanistan. So Iran was kind of this country where we could, interact unofficially, but never could get visas, never could enter, never could officially work, and was always through contacts. And, I think it's really amazing to see even before this. And I think the Mahsa Amini protests and everything that's happening in Iran is evident of the fact that there has been, despite of all of the suppression on all the crackdown on press freedom and speech and gender equality in Iran, it's amazing to see how people have continued to remember what their rights are and to fight for them, especially the younger generation. Majority of the journalists you see right now, like the ones that we have documented, we have about 44 women reporters, only women, 44 journalists behind bars right now. This is apart from the journalists, about 20 journalists who have been released. And I will talk about the conditions of journalists as well. I'll be happy to give you some details on that. But it's really amazing to see that these journalists have been working and they have been finding ways of reporting and going back in very risky circumstances where all of them know almost 100% that they're going to get arrested. And there will be other consequences too, that it won't end with an arrest, that they're very likely to get beaten. Any journalists that we have been able to connect with through lawyers in the prison, we know that there have been physical violence. There's everything from pulling of the hair to beating to lashes to not giving food for days, isolation, putting them in isolated positions. Also, one of the I think it's really brutal, where family is given misinformation about the journalist who is in prison by authorities, by guards, and sometimes they're told that the individual is not alive anymore, like that kind of misinformation to really, I think it's really to break the spirit of families. So I think there's a lot of strategic tactic, which is very abusive, that is going on as well. And finally, I would just say that I think that strategically we see that it's really incredible to see how Iranian authorities are able to be so dispirited in terms of their moral compass, where you have a civil society which is very alive in their moral compass and their need and their ability to understand that they really want to have freedom, free speech. They're done with this, oppressive, and they're really risking their lives to it.
Yes, I was researching for this show and just trying to get more information that I just today learned about the news that the judiciary court is going to basically they've charged them for some conspiracy and their relationship with the US, and there is going to be perhaps, I'm not sure whether or not they are going to go into that extent, but perhaps that penalty against these two reporters. Here's what I'm thinking. In one end, when I was working back in Iran, we were dying for having our stories to be taken by the international news, because we knew that if Iran cares so much about its own face, its own prestige, especially in the Middle East, and then when they are challenged by the international community, they take things seriously. So in one hand, these two reporters, they got the Nieman Award for conscience and integrity from Harvard University. They got penned as two of the most important people by Time magazine on their pioneers. So they have this international recognition, yet the Iranian government is threatening their livelihood. So now I'm thinking, what is the deal here? And I just want to see. Yeah, go ahead. I want to see why this is happening.
I just want to say that's precisely the reason, Sarah. Like, what we are seeing is that especially the journalists who have an international profile, we are seeing the government going after them even more. I will tell you that there are a few journalists who had been in the news, and we had been relocating them, and we had authorities go from one city to another city, which means the authorities are essentially in different cities. There are different authorities that are in power, so they're coordinating with each other to track down human rights defenders, activists, any dissident voice in the country, especially those who are known outside of Iran. Because also, let's say that, I mentioned that, there's a strong civil society that is fighting for freedom, right? And the rights. But there's also a huge population in Iran that believes the regime. And the regime not only wants to have, that image internationally and regionally, but I think they cannot have power if they are, if those people who still believe in the regime and its power, do not remember that these dissidents are actually enemies of the state. So these charges that you see that are more aggressive against journalists and activists who are, especially women, who are essentially on the front of, on the cover of this story. And so, we are absolutely not surprised, but obviously we are very concerned as well, because there's no way you can be inside the country and change anything that is going on in terms of intervening any of these cases and whatever outcome there would be.
Yeah, but here's the thing. I mean, maybe Nazila can explain this. When we were filing stories, when we were going after stories, we knew that we are doing something wrong against the authority, against the establishment, and yet we decided to do this. And perhaps yeah. I mean, I'm just trying to see. Many of the journalists knew that they are putting themselves into danger. They knew that the government is going to come after them, and they still did it, and they are still doing it. So what is the mindset? What's wrong with our mindset that we are willing to put ourselves in danger? What do you think, Nazila?
Well, I think that's human nature, and that's going to continue. There will be other reporters in the future who will pursue the story and want to expose whatever is wrong. I can tell you for myself, we grew up in Iran. I did. You did too, I think. This was the life that we had. We didn't know any other life. I did know sometimes I was violating some of the rules, but I was doing it all the time. I was the girl who was forced to cover her hair, and I hated it. And anytime I found the opportunity to take off my headscarf or to let it slide back, I would. So defying the laws of the Islamic Republic was nothing that scared me. And in the end, I was forced to leave for something that I never thought would be the reason. And I think the reason Niloofar and any other reporter has been jailed is not because a specific story that they worked and they knew that this is the story that is going to get me into trouble, because she didn't know that there would be such a big uprising after she revealed what happened to Mahsa Amini. So we never know exactly what is it that we do that will lead to trouble. Mm-hmm. And we were young, and there will be other people who will keep on doing this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was very impressed by the women that I met the first time I went to Iran in 1996. And, I think Iranian women, they say they're lionesses. The more you try to suppress and discriminate, the more it is your nature to fight back. And I saw that among many women who were fighting back in many ways. The first stories I did were actually about women in Iran. And I remember Shahla Shirkat, who was the editor of a women's magazine. I met Faiza Hashemi, who even in those days was quite outspoken. She's, of course, become much more outspoken. So these were regime women, women who wore the chador, and yet they were incredibly fierce. I just wanted to mention, we have a story up on the Stimson website about the poisoning of girls. And there, of course, is a huge suspicion that this is being done by the government itself to try to keep girls from protesting. And I'm reading, this is a piece we had written for us by someone in Tehran. It has a newspaper called Hamedi, which wrote about the attacks. And it has an emergency room doctor who is quoted as saying that the gas used in the attacks is, quote, a complicated combination of several gas agents which are impossible for ordinary people to access, unquote, i.e. it had to be the government which was using these agents to make all these girls sick and dizzy and nauseous. This is journalism that is going on today in Iran. I don't know who the reporter was, who wrote the story, who did the interview with the emergency room doctor, but it is continuing to go on. And journalists, as we all know, if you really are a strong believer in this profession, if this is really your vocation as much as it is your career, you don't let anybody tell you not. And one lesson I learned very early on as a journalist, and I learned it in the United States and I used it in Iran, was that I often did not ask permission before I did something. If I thought I could get away with it without asking permission, I would just go and do it. And that's what people are still doing in Iran. Incredible courage.
Absolutely. So one thing that I'm seeing, at least in my experience, is the Iran's middle class and civil society. Middle class is very, very large. I mean, right now the gap between the people who are really, really wealthy and people who are not wealthy is big. But nevertheless, the middle class has always been very big. And what the middle class is, they usually have education, and they usually can manage their life and their lifestyle in a standard of the country or the nation or the culture that they are living. The other issue, I mean, the middle class is large. At the same time, women usually are not left alone to fight this fight. Usually they have men's backing. And I think that's something significant, in my opinion. Every time, and it is because, you know, going back to the Iranian culture or heritage, it's we say that being a king in one day is better than to living a life as a slave. So therefore, they just fight. They fight, and they it's a social matter, social justice, that men also back women within the society. And I think that's one of the reasons this uprising is going on. And I'm just curious to see whether or not what is your take on how and in what way men are supporting women, because right now everyone is really suffering because of the corruption, because of the bad economy, because of the bad government. Everyone is suffering, but women are putting themselves forward for this bad law. So I'm thinking, what is your take on how much support women are getting in this new upheaval?
Who's that for?
Yeah, I mean, maybe, Karen, do you have any idea?
I could tell you a little bit from our experience. Actually, we are now working a lot with male reporters and journalists and activists and lawyers who are bringing the information. Briefly, I wanted to touch upon your previous question, which, Nazila, you were mentioning as well, that, you know, how you were going and reporting and what it was like. You know, you were wondering what it was like for Niloofar or Elahe. I wanted to mention that we were in touch with them, and after them, they were friends, and we know that they were very aware of the risk of the story. And this particular case, before Niloofar went to the hospital and she took those photos that was later released to the media, she was warned by authorities. She was told not to go, and she was stopped and impeded. And then she still found a way, and she went and took photographs because she was determined. And I also want to say that majority of the journalists right now, Iranian journalists who are behind bars, they're local reporters who don't get salaries that are, you know, efficient to the economy at the time. And these journalists are really, when we speak to those journalists, we noticed that they really, at this particular point, they really cared about it. And I think the reason is that the last few years, and you're all following what's happening in the country. So you know that in the last few years, what has been going on is this really a great need for revolution. I think the frustration was growing. And I think Mahsa Amini was a culmination point. Before her, there were several incidents that were very similar that had happened in Iran, where women in different parts of the country have gotten arrested, thrown into the prison, and the frustration kept growing. So I think there has been a social frustration that was growing, and journalists were like, let's do this. Activists and journalists have all been working together, and a lot of the journalists that we had been in touch with, who were informing us in the beginning, we were trying to monitor the situation, so seeing who's getting arrested in which city, and majority of the reporters who were telling us giving us information through social media platforms, WhatsApp, Signal, they got arrested too. So 90% of our initial sources from 2022 are all behind bars right now. Some of them we tried relocating, and then they were arrested from different cities as well. So, I do want to say that I think that at this point, a lot of activists, journalists, lawyers, they knew what was going on, and they still went on and reported because they cared about, doing this. And speaking of men, right now, we are actually getting most of our information is coming from journalists that we were able to evacuate, and their husbands and brothers who are on the ground, or a lot of male activists. And I think from our perspective, men are as involved in this movement as are women. And maybe the reason is that it's about Iran. It is about the country. It is about the sense of belonging to this country, and what the identity of this country is, and the dignity of the country, where men think that it is the same. It is all in the same. They don't want any oppression. And it begins with, the freedom of the women, perhaps.
Somehow government is now bringing men into this fight. So they are using this phrase we use in Farsi language, غیرت, or honor. So they are tapping into this honor issue. They are saying, okay, so you are not, the pamphlet and reports that I'm getting from my friends on the ground and from my editors, that pamphlet among in the streets, just giving out to men, or into taxi, or in different settings, that is saying you're not man enough if you let your woman to go without hijab, or you are not man enough to don't do this. Where is your honor? And I've hearing that men do not give it damn about any of these warnings. So I'm thinking that it's just beyond man or woman. It's, as Kiran said, it's really about this nation and their willingness to just change what's happening.
The latest arrests I've read about came from a clubhouse meeting that was called to talk about a constitutional referendum in Iran to get rid of Velayat-e Faqih, to get rid of the Islamic Republic, essentially. And they arrested Abdullah Momeni, I believe, who used to be a student activist back in the day. They arrested people who had worked with Mir Hussein Mousavi in 2009 during his campaign. There are a lot of men who have been arrested as well. Many of them old reformists, old student activists who have come out again in support of women, life, freedoms. So I think women started this, women have led it, but there are many, many men who are also participating in what is really a kind of grassroots upheaval now.
Yeah, Nazila, I wanted to. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this latest uprising had a very feminist voice. It had women at its forefront. But this was for those of us who have covered Iran for many, many years and have seen a lot of protests, we know that Iranian society is like a time bomb. And there are just different things that trigger the protests. And no matter how many times they silence people, the anger and the frustration is not going away. This is not about women. This is not about men. This is about the entire Iranian society.
Mhm. I wanted to ask you whether or not you have any, favorite story or favorite, favorite story that you covered or you came across that was really meaningful to you or touched you. I wanted to see, for me, one thing that I can explain. I worked for Faiza Hashemi Rafsanjani in Zan newspaper, and there was a time during the first, I think one of the first uprising. It's not a uplifting story, but it's a story that really stick with me throughout until I die probably. And that was, they told me they are this a pressure group is in Salam newspaper. So I was working for Zan newspaper and then freelancing for Salam newspaper. I had many friends in Salam newspaper. So I just ran into the newspaper, took the taxi, just got myself into the paper to see what's happening. As soon as I was in front of this, it was a 5-6 story building. In front of the building, I saw a few of my friends were being thrown away from the fifth floor to the ground. And it was, at the time I could not imagine and understand the brutality. I kept telling myself, how could you, how an Iranian can kill an Iranian like this? And when I just saw that, for me, I was even more determined to go back to Zan newspaper and to write about whatever was happening. So it's not uplifting story, but a story that really has never left me, seeing that kind of brutality. I'm wondering if you have a story that you think that always sticks with you or is always with you.
I have a rather creepy story.
Yes.
That in hindsight is even stranger. But I had very good access to officials when Ahmadinejad was the president. I think it was because I worked for USA Today, and he thought if he talked to me or if his people talked to me, that they would be reaching, the ordinary American. And no offense, Nazila, but not the elite that read the New York Times. And I did an interview once with Mohsen Rezai, who was, I guess he was he? It was already after Ahmadinejad had been elected, but I got an interview with him, and it was in Lavizan. It was in a barracks. And we had to go through all of this security to get there. I remember my driver, who was a very experienced driver with journalists, he was somewhat freaked out. And we went into this room, and there was a long table and a bunch of scruffy looking men in military fatigues on one side of the table with, the 3 days growth and everything. And on the other side, there was me, my translator, and Mohsen Rezai. And we did the interview and so on. And then I was told a year or so later that one of the scruffy looking men on the other side of the table was Qasem Soleimani, who was curious about what the American journalist was going to ask this old, IRGC guy. And it impressed me with his intelligence in a way, but it also made me feel very strange, especially given the role that he later assumed. There was one other too, if I may.
Yeah.
It's at the very end of my book, Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the U.S. and the Twisted Path to Confrontation. And it was during a period when it looked like the U.S. might go to war with Iran. How many times have we had? Yeah. And I was interviewing this woman in South Tehran, and she told me that we have a special respect for Americans. When my children watch TV, they always say the people of the US are very good, but their government is not good. And then she said, I would sacrifice myself and my 4 kids for God. Bush and the United States should not force their ways on us. And then she added, we don't want anything bad to happen. Pray for us. We always pray for you. It was, such a gut punch to meet this poor woman who had this good feeling toward the people of my country and who was patriotic and would defend her country against the United States. But that was the last thing she wanted to have to do, to defend Iran against the United States. That always stuck with me.
Can I ask, Barbara, did you speak to her, or that's?
Yeah. This is someone I interviewed in South Tehran.
Wow.
I mean, I used to go everywhere, you know, and I went as many places as I could, and spoke to as many ordinary people as I could. I didn't just interview Mohsen Rezaei or sit with Quds Force folks, although I met a fair number of them as well, I have to say. And of course, Ahmadinejad himself.
You learn so much about how policies reverberate in a nation by speaking to ordinary people. You can see what's happening, what Qasem Soleimani is doing, what he did, and how much, you know, how he was received by the people. That tells a lot about why he was so successful.
If I may, one other anecdote. When Rouhani was inaugurated, that was my last trip there. And I remember going around to shops and whatnot and asking people, what do you think of Rouhani? And they basically said, oh, he's the same as all the others. And I found that Americans were more excited about Rouhani than Iranians were, at least at the beginning. I don't know. I mean, the sense of cynicism after Khatami, you know, the sense of cynicism about the system just kept growing and growing and growing. And that's why Nazila is right. I mean, it is a time bomb. It's just, you know, what will spark the fire.
So I want to take on Kiran and Nazila, your favorite stories.
Favorite stories in Iran? It's hard to tell. It's very hard. I mean, you know, I think I have always been baffled by the dichotomy in Iran. So I'm going to tell you one story. This is early 1990s. The Iranian population has grown far too much. And now the Iranian government is introducing birth control. So they offer free birth control pills. And to men, they provide them with free vasectomy. And vasectomy is not viewed very positively in the West at all. But somehow they had a fatwa from Hamedi, who had just become the supreme leader, that it was fine, it was okay. Or even, I don't remember what the fatwa was, but he was even encouraging. So they actually invited me to go to one of the clinics where they were performing vasectomy. And this was still the days when I was fully covered, wore black, wore my longest coat, wore my longest headscarf, wrapped myself, didn't show a strand of hair. We went to the clinic, and I was with this British reporter, and the doctor came out and asked if I wanted to go in and see what they were doing. And there was a minder from the Ministry of Culture, a female woman. And we looked at each other and she said yes. And when she said yes, I said yes too. So the three of us went into the room where three men were lying on a bed. They were exposed. And there was this doctor who looked at us as if we were medical students and showed us this tool he had. And he said, you look at this, it's as simple as this. And the men were fully awake. I think it was just, you know, a very simple operation. They were looking at us. They had blushed. I tried to ignore their faces. And we just stood there and watched this operation. The guy used this tool. I was fully covered, but I was watching the whole thing. And nobody had thought to get permission from these poor guys who were so embarrassed. I was in my 20s, and this other lady who was from the Ministry of Culture was also in her 20s. When we walked out, we thought we'd watched some kind of like an interesting scientific procedure. And I didn't realize that this young British guy who was with us, he was a lot more embarrassed than we were.
That's great.
Did you write about this?
No, I didn't write about it. I was not a reporter then. This was like, I was in my very early 20s. I didn't have credentials to work as a reporter. I was just working as a translator. But, this whole thing did not fall under some of the laws that they have to keep women away from exposed men.
That's funny story. That's funny.
I will say
Karen.
this is a perfect anecdote to share in the times that we are in right now with all of the the gender barriers. That you could remember something like that and discuss something like that as well. I would imagine some because we get trolled by Iranian trolls a lot. Some government hackers and stuff. I would say this kind of stuff kind of can get a lot of attention of the wrong people too. But I'm glad that you remember that.
So, Karen, do you have any favorite story that you would like to share?
Sarah, I would say that I haven't worked in Iran. I will say there's something that I wanted to mention was, when Barbara was talking about it, I was thinking, I had just a few understanding that I had of Iran was when I was a war correspondent and I worked in Iraq and Syria. And so I knew Hashtashabi. Before I started this organization, I just knew Iran as, these security agency trying to manipulate everything in the region. And I had covered Hashtashabi a little bit because I was covering Iraq and I covered a little bit of Syria. And I saw Iran in different forms of disrupting the region, with a very different perspective, sometimes in the Kurdish regions. So that, Iranian militia and all of these other agencies, security agencies came up a lot in my work. But I think I had no idea before when I was doing that work, I had no idea that Iranian journalists, which the work that I do now and with the organization and, the work that our team does, that, so much of learning has happened to see how Iranian journalists in that environment have worked. So I am just, I think I'm just amazed by that, how Iranian journalists have continued their work in the country. And then also a lot of journalists who leave the country and for decades, there's so many amazing Iranian journalists who live in the US and UK and Europe and Turkey who are continuing the work. They've started news channels, they work in exile, then they continue doing the reporting. And I think that also has created that kind of connection, the bridge between the world outside of Iran and inside Iran, because of these people who have done that work after getting into prison and then released from prison and then leaving the country. And I think that's just incredible of how Iranian civil society has continued to believing something that they can see does not exist for them in their daily life.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Please stay put with me. You are watching and listening to Peace Mindedly, a podcast featuring peaceful bridge makers. For this hour, we are talking with Nazila Fathi, author of The Lonely War, One Woman's Account of Struggle for Modern Iran, and also former New York Times correspondent in Tehran, Barbara Slavin, a distinguished fellow at my English Stimson Center, and also the former director of the Future of Iran Initiative, and Karen Nazish, award-winning journalist and founding director of Coalition for Women in Journalism, short for CFWIJ. And we are talking about the journalism in Iran, how it's really unfolding, what's happening, and the danger of being a journalist in countries like Iran, countries like Russia, probably experience the same fate when you do not have an open society or democratic society, and then you do have people who really want to fight for social justice, fight for freedom. So therefore, you have this kind of situations that punish journalists for the work that they are doing. Niloofar Hamedi and Elahe Mohammadi are the two reporters broke the fast one of the fascinating stories. Honestly, when they reporting on the story, they really didn't know, as our guests really explained, that this is going to be the next step for forward for their stories. That now we are dealing with probably the third or fourth. I mean, significant upheaval in Iran, and it's gone past through many of the stages. And now, not only women want the bad law to change, but also the regime change, and they are fighting for that. Women are the forefront of this new revolution, and then men are supporting full-fledged, and I'm really proud of the work that these women and men are doing back in Iran. At the end of every program, we ask our guests to share something meaningful about peace, about kindness and compassion. And first, I really would like to see whether or not our guests would like to share anything further about themselves and about the work that they do. And then we are going to go close the program with the peace, kindness, and compassion. So I'm wondering, I'll start with Kiran. Would you like to tell us about your organization and the work that you are doing right now?
Thank you. We're called the Coalition for Women in Journalism. We're a New York-based press freedom and advocacy organization for women and non-binary journalists. We cover 128 countries. We monitor press freedom, violations against women and non-binary journalists, and in that, a lot of times we are involved in advocacy, so helping with cases where journalists are imprisoned, put behind bars, or they're at risk. So we also do emergency assistance, legal assistance, and those kind of things. You could say we're something like a grassroots version of Reporters Without Borders, but for women. We are about to actually later this year, we're launching rebranding our work, because a lot of it is press freedom related, and we started as a support organization. So we're going to be launching with a new name called Women Press Freedom later this year. Would love to keep everyone in loop as well. Yeah, and in that Iran has from the beginning, Iran has been one of the top countries that we have been on the radar, because it's one of the top 5 countries, has always been one of the top 5 countries when it comes to imprisonments of women journalists. So China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Turkey. But right now, Iran is the top jailer of women journalists around the world.
Wow, top jailer. At least we got top number 1 in something. My goodness. And Barbara, update us about yourself and any closing before we go for the last piece.
Yeah, one of the things I've enjoyed the most since I left daily journalism is working on people-to-people relations of various sorts. When in my previous job, I was able to bring a documentary filmmaker from Iran to show a film about the Hamoons, which is an endangered wetland on the border with Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I also had programs with athletes and people who promoted exchanges having to do with wrestling and with volleyball and these sorts of things. I very much enjoyed that. I was also able to help get a couple of people out of Iran, journalists and journalists' wives, to come to the United States through what were then my good connections with the State Department. They're not maybe as close as they were in those days. And that made me feel very good as well. But whenever I could help an artist or an academic, I've tried to continue to maintain ties with Iranian professors, academics to the extent possible. And the only silver lining, I guess, of COVID was that we were able to have these Zoom panels and sometimes have people from Iran take part. And I have a blog called Middle East Voices, which I've started up at the Stimson Center. And we have some folks from Iran who do occasionally write for it as well as people from other countries and places in the Middle East. So I'm doing my bit to keep people connected and to try to give a sense of what it's really like on the ground for those of us who can't go to Iran anymore. And unfortunately, that includes a lengthening list of people who would love to go back but can't.
Absolutely. Yes, I think I'm one of them. Nazila, go ahead.
So I consider myself a storyteller, and because I wasn't able to tell my favorite story from inside Iran, I decided to tell stories to kids because I am a mother. I have two kids who grew up here and know very little about their home country. So I wrote 4 children's books, all of them based on Persian history and Persian figures, and they are just geared toward kids of Iranian origin who have grown up here and know very little about Iran and history of Iran. My next book is about Kambojiye or Kambiz, the son of Cyrus. One of the books is about Cyrus. One is about Razi, and one is about Abu Ali Sina. And one of them, of course, is about 2 Iranian women, Purandukt, a queen, and also a warrior who fought against the Arabs during the invasion that led to the fall of the Persian Empire.
Fascinating. Where can we find those books?
They are all on Amazon.
Excellent. Tell me the titles. Do you remember the titles again?
My name is Cyrus. Avicenna, the father of modern medicine, Razi, the man who invented how to make alcohol, and the Persian warrior and her queen.
Excellent. Fascinating. Fascinating. And then, yes, I'm going to invite our guests to share something meaningful about peace, kindness, and compassion. Maybe I'm guessing who would like to go first. Go, Barbara. Yes, we are going to start with you.
Well, look, I've tried to be a peacemaker my whole life. I haven't succeeded very well, I must say. But here's a story. It's about not Iran for a change. When I was a journalist in the 90s, I went to North Korea, which was going through a terrible famine. And I didn't know, what could I bring? What could I bring? I bought these giant chocolate bars at a local store. I mean, they were quite large. And I remember the government there wanted publicity for the famine because they wanted food aid. And they let us travel pretty much anywhere. And we went into this little village. We went into people's homes. We saw they had no food. And there was this little kid, and I gave him this chocolate bar. And he held it like it was glass that would break in his hands. And, all I could imagine was that he and his family would eat a little bit of it every day, just to have something sweet and to have some calories. It was my gesture anyway, to try to help people who were in desperate straits. And
Beautiful.
I always remember, the governments may be our enemies, but the people are never our enemies.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Barbara. I believe I'm going to go to Nazila next.
Well, I don't have any words of wisdom for you, Sarah, but I can tell you I grew up during the war with Iraq, 8 years. And all my friends, people of my generation, still remember those days. And I can tell you with certainty that none of us want to see those days again, or any kind of invasion or attack, or any kind of move that would lead to bloodshed. And I hope that doesn't happen anymore.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Okay, sorry. And yes, Kira, let me see. Let me figure this out. Excellent. And you're up next. Go.
Thank you. I don't know what story to share. I think I can share a little bit about myself and the organization. Briefly, I started my career in Pakistan as a Pakistani journalist in 1999, before 9/11. And we were like, when I started my career, we were all about science and technology, and the millennium was going to happen. So it was a very different mentality. But anyways, eventually I spent most of my career, covering, the post 9/11 world, from Pakistan to Afghanistan, the region, India. Dabbled with, sometimes teaching journalism as well at different universities in different countries around the world. I covered the Middle East, Mexico, Latin America. And one thing that I just, I think every few years of my career as a woman reporter, oftentimes I was in places where I was, especially when I was a war correspondent, I was the only one in a lot of, in different ways, sometimes the only woman, sometimes the only woman of color. And there were all of these other issues that were always going on with women. And, I think I was a little privileged in my career, but I saw a lot of things that were happening to women in general all over the world. And you were talking about, like, let's talk about something like peace, kindness. And I would say, I think that in my entire career, I just saw women not being treated equally in journalism, generally anywhere, but especially in journalism and media. And the difficulties that they faced had everything to do from everything between sexual harassment to when they were targeted, as journalists, that they had no resources, not the same kind of support systems internationally or locally. I worked at the New York Times briefly, and Jill Abramson was fired when I was there. And, the kind of reaction of the newsroom at the time and of the industry, this is all before Me Too. And I think that in that moment, there was this instinct where, after 20 years in my career, I got really tired, sick. And literally, I was hospitalized as well because the PTSD kind of grew. And a lot of that was because of the injustices that I saw as a woman for myself and for my fellow female journalists. So when I started this organization, it was an act of love. It was an act of compassion to try to fix things that were happening around us everywhere around the world, in the US, but also in other parts of the world where I had worked. And I think that is what we're trying to do. And I think to some extent, we're not, we're still a small organization, but to some extent that compassion and kindness works. We have been able to, evacuate Afghan journalists and Ukrainian journalists and, journalists who are in crisis. We have released women journalists from prisons. And a lot of that, that doing the rebuilding, the nurturing, worked, and it works. And so I think the alternative of anger for me was compassion and love. And I think sometimes it works if you do it strategically.
Beautiful. Thank you so very much for being with me, for being on this show, in this program. I learned a great deal and truly appreciate. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. Khuda Hafiz.